Heya.
(1492). Columbus arrives on an island that he believes is just off the coast of Asia. He and his men disembark and arrive onto the shore, where they're greeted by, well, nobody. Alright, Columbus thinks. That makes sense, considering just how far away from the continent they are. He figures that nobody possibly could have sailed this far east. And so the ship continues on. They arrive on another island. Still nobody. Island after island. Trip after trip. Nobody. Nothing. Upon arriving back to Europe, Columbus tells the Spanish crown that as far as he knows, they have just found a land entirely untouched by man. A series of uninhabited islands right off the coast of Cipangu, where the Spanish could set up a fort and explore further to finally reach East Asia. So further expeditions are funded. More ships set sail for the Indies. But with each venture, the Spanish aren't met with Indios who might sell them spices and gold, nor Chinese with bountiful silk or porcelain. All they find is jungle and forest. As they would come to discover, this new world was empty. Humans never crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago. These two land masses are entirely uninhabited. Hi. So this idea is really strange. In fact, one could say that this is kind of offensive and odd to imagine a world where Native Americans just never existed. And I agree, it is strange. So what spurred this idea? What am I doing? This isn't some colonizing fantasy. Calm down, Twitter. What sparked this idea was this map. Or at least maps just like it. In my opinion, the migration into the Americas is probably one of the most fascinating parts of human history. It's something that's just so mind-boggling that scientists and anthropologists, even today, still don't really agree on how people really crossed into these continents. Either by glacial passes or by boat, the time frame is fuzzy. All we know is that it happened, and in a relatively short amount of time, humans made these two land masses their new home, passing through vastly different biomes until eventually reaching the bottom of the world, and even islands off of the coast. And it was all in part because Alaska and Siberia just happened to connect during the last ice age. I don't know if you would call that coincidental, but it's certainly interesting. Because these two continents just happened to be close enough, it allowed for ancient people to somehow cross into it, leading to all these various civilizations and cultures that would come to populate the Americas. What if that wasn't the case? Like, how vastly different would human history be as a whole if those ancient descendants of modern-day Native Americans never crossed into the New World? What if these continents were left untouched until somebody else came across them in a boat? Yeah, this is a strange idea, I know. One thing that I find so fascinating about the Americas is up until 20,000 years ago, they didn't have an ape of any kind. Primates had come from Africa, so even to this day, it's a mystery how the New World monkeys came to be. In the Old World, hominids had spread out for the last 2 million years or so, and by the last 50,000 years, Homo sapiens were across all of Europe, Asia, and even Australia for tens of thousands of years before anybody had set foot in the Americas. My point here is that compared to these continents, the Americas were kind of the new world even for the descendants of Native Americans. And there's a few theories for when and how humans crossed into this land. The original idea was that during the last ice age, sea levels were so low that humans used the ancient land bridge of Beringia to cross into the Americas once the glaciers finally melted. See, there's this little corridor that they crossed into and then populated the rest of the continent. Pretty simple. If we're imagining some alternate scenario, let's just imagine that this ancient land bridge didn't exist, and now nobody walks into North America. Pretty easy, right? Wrong. Recent studies have found sites that actually predate the melting of the ice. Somehow humans might have crossed into the Americas before the glaciers actually melted. But how? Well, boats. It was boats. It's perfectly reasonable to assume that Ice Age people just hugged the shores of the West Coast, bypassing the glaciers altogether. What I'm getting at here is that in this alternate timeline, there can't be a possible way for people to cross by either land or sea. The only way these hunter-gatherers were not crossing into the Americas is if they didn't think it existed. They never saw them in the first place. Is there a scientific way that this can happen? Some glacial reason or climate change that might have slightly altered things? What's gonna be the point of divergence that causes this whole scenario to happen? Yep. There we go. There really isn't a reasonable scientific way of approaching this. Beringia wasn't some small land bridge that happened to exist for a brief amount of time. North America and Asia were just fused off and on for millions of years. Humans are innovative, and whether it was by land or sea, they were gonna make it to the Americas whether this glacier melted or if this land bridge was here or not. So the only real solution is to remove Alaska. I'm removing Alaska. This creates a distance that is too great for hunter-gatherer peoples to sail across. It's too far, maybe anybody that crosses in a canoe just gets killed by a whale. By either way, this butterflies the timeline in a way that there is just no Native Americans. This isn't really the most realistic scenario, if you couldn't tell already. If this was our reality, somehow, it would butterfly the timeline in more ways than just no people here. For one, horses and camelids both evolved in the Americas. They used that natural land bridge to populate the rest of the old world. This video isn't really about being 100% realistic, because if that was the case, then the history of the Eurasian civilizations would just be so dramatically different they'd be unrecognizable. No horse lords of Central Asia, no chariots, you get the point. I want to focus purely on the human element of this. Two land masses completely void of people. What exactly could that be like? So let's imagine that the Spanish arrived into the Americas and they found absolutely nobody. Circling back to that Columbus idea, say he did find a series of uninhabited islands. Well, for one, this fundamentally changes the way the Spanish approach colonization in general, mainly because of the lack of the Taino people. The Taino were the native people of the Caribbean. Now, the Spanish saw that the Taino had one thing they really wanted: gold. Or at least their gold earrings were evidence enough that there was gold on the island, which meant that these people not only had to lead the Spanish to where the gold was, but everyone now had to mine it forever. This is a messed up chicken or the egg situation if you think about it. If these islands didn't already have a population that could be enslaved, would the Spanish have set up shop in the first place and colonized this land like they did? If they didn't see the Taino earrings, would they have gone and searched for gold at all? For now at least, I could still see them creating an initial colony on the island. One that is at least a home base to venture toward whatever was west. That initial enslavement of the Taino was the fire that fueled the rapidly early investment into the Spanish colonies. Without the Taino to kind of grind into dust, the initial operation is a lot slower than in our own timeline. Like, it would take a little bit for the initial slaves from Africa to eventually arrive and work the land, farming the very first cash crops. Sugar isn't native to the Americas. Tobacco, on the other hand, is native to America, along with a bunch of other crops, but I'll get to that in a bit. Eventually, further expeditions would go down the Mexican coast and explore much of the Gulf. In our timeline, it was here that the conquistadors heard from the natives that there was a grand empire further inland. So they went to go see what it was, and you know the rest of the story. How exactly would the conquest of Mexico happen if there was no Mexico, no Aztec Empire, to begin with? And the answer is, there wouldn't be, at least in the way that we know it. In our history, the Spanish didn't conquer Mexico by wiping out the Aztecs and taking their land. Instead, they simply overthrew the leading authority while absorbing the people into their greater empire. So Spain became the new lords of a massive native population that, while severely diminished due to disease, still bounced back to become the foundational labor force of New Spain. When imagining this scenario, you might think that two continents without any people would make colonization incredibly easy for the Spanish, But in reality, it would actually be the opposite. What made Spain into the empire it was discovering a land full of people already there and simply taking it over. Instead, Spain is left to colonize America in a far different way, because what the Spanish are met with is jungle. Untamed jungle, a far cry from a well-populated network of towns, villages, and cities. The Caribbean may be relatively easy to conquer for the Spanish, considering these are a series of islands that can be accessed by a ship. But when it comes to the mainland, that's gonna be more difficult. Not impossible, just more difficult, and fundamentally different. The Spanish wouldn't conquer Mexico, but instead they would settle the region like the Portuguese settled Brazil. For Portugal, settlement was much slower considering the Portuguese would need to do all the manual labor themselves, or at least wait to import a population to do the manual labor. This is in part why Brazil was so ignored until the rapid importation of slaves. People like immediate returns on their investments, and unexplored land with no development is a lot less exciting than land with somebody to trade with, or to conquer. But even Portugal isn't the best example to use for this alternate scenario, but the Portuguese still interacted and traded with the natives to cut down the Brazil wood for which the region is named. Without that initial native labor, who's to say how quickly this colony would have built up? The reality here is that native labor in some way or another helped kickstart these colonies either through trade, conquest, or plain manual labor. Colonization in this alternate timeline would be much more like landing on a foreign planet. There would be nobody to trade with, which means that initially, people would be more tied to the sea. In this alternate timeline, the first major colonies on the mainland would be on the Gulf Coast, not in the center of Mexico. What guided Spanish policy in the Americas was overseeing and converting the people who already lived there. This meant that their center of interest was always going to be in central Mexico and Peru. Without any people though, does New Spain expand in the same way that it did? I kind of doubt it. Spain's main focus in this alternate timeline, for a long time, would really just be the Caribbean. And then when they did eventually expand, it would be around the Gulf Coast, including what we would call the southern United States. Why did the Spanish never colonize the South? They were right there. In our timeline, they never colonized the South because they already had a bunch of other priorities. That doesn't mean they didn't explore it, they did, and then they got killed by the natives. In a scenario where population is not a factor, Spain could play it safe with coastal colonies all across the Gulf. In our timeline, North America wasn't focused on by Spain as much because they controlled the metropolitan and richest areas of the continent. To them, the North was seen as unpopulated and rural. Yet if there were no Aztecs, then the only difference here is geography, and also the location of gold. Let's say that these alternate Spanish conquistadors somehow do find gold reserves without prior knowledge of this land. No knowledge of Aztec gold or where gold might even be. It's not insane to imagine they might find deposits, but it'd be much more difficult, especially compared to just forcing the Aztec or Inca to tell them where they found it. As much as I've talked about Mexico, the conquest of the Inca was the main jumpstart to the Spanish economy, purely because Spain was able to take over the silver mines. Spain's silver mines made it into the superpower of its day. Silver paid for its slaves, and it paid for its wars. And those mines were worked by native Incas, by the thousands, and it was deadly work. A lot just didn't survive the conditions. In such a scenario, how long would it be for Spain to explore this region? And if silver is discovered, how long until they bring in a workforce to mine it? Because I doubt your average Spanish peasant would want to go halfway across the world to work in the Potosi mines. This would be the best case scenario for their empire, assuming they can still find the mines. From the Spanish or Castilian perspective, they may even imagine that they've been kind of screwed over by the Pope, considering the Portuguese received the rich and populated lands of Asia. Meanwhile, Spain would need to invest so much time and money into building up these colonies to even get back their investment. If gold or silver was just never discovered, then the endeavor could be viewed as a folly. But that wouldn't stop others from wanting to try their own hand at it. Compared to the Spanish, the English and French had no great cities to conquer in North America. They both interacted with hunter-gatherer tribes, and they each treated them far differently. The French had a beaver pelt trading empire, tapping into a long-existing network across the Great Lakes. There were never really many French colonists in New France, at least compared to the English. Just like the Spanish, they remained in urban areas or forts while the natives did a lot of the work. Work in this sense wasn't tilling the land, it was hunting for beavers. Without their native allies, the French would have to hunt beaver pelts themselves. Still a lucrative business, but it'd be a far smaller endeavor. And it's not like the French would be able to make up for this with an influx of immigrants, since, unlike the English, the French didn't really like to leave France. So the beaver trade wouldn't really be this massive industry, but instead more of a niche luxury. And then we have England. If you ask the English in colonial times, they probably would have loved if the natives just didn't exist. Spanish Catholics at least saw them as subjects to convert. Colonial England converted some natives, sure, but there was a clear, distinct barrier between the two. Natives, even England's colonial allies, were viewed as kind of a part of the wilderness. They would think this is the best case scenario, but would it really be for them? Starting off with an easy example, the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were in rough shape that first winter, and without the help from their neighbors, they probably would have starved. This is like first grade stuff, everybody knows this. Plymouth Colony dying wouldn't be that big of a setback. One, because they were just pilgrims, and two, the English were always going to just send more colonists to claim this land. The thing that changes in this timeline is the reason they set up those colonies. For this whole scenario, I've only really been saying half of the truth. While the Americas didn't have a lot of animals, they more than made up for it with crops. Domesticated crops that just so happened to be so important, they allowed the modern world as we know it to exist. Corn, tomatoes, potatoes, staples of any diet today. Crops that didn't simply originate in America, but were domesticated there. These crops do not look like this in their natural form. Ever see undomesticated corn? These are plants that would not have been domesticated without these people being here. In the first few centuries, things might not seem that dramatically different compared to our own timeline. But as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, that story begins to change. Before the Columbian Exchange, Europe frequently saw famines due to crop failure. Localized famines were common all the time, but that all changed with the introduction of corn and the potato. This was a reliable crop that was dense with calories, but it took a little bit to be adopted throughout Europe. But when it was, it changed everything. Europeans simply stopped starving. The average peasant, for the first time ever, could actually feed themselves reliably. The standard of living rapidly improved, causing a population boom the region had never seen before. These new crops with higher calories meant that fewer people needed to be farmers. We can imagine any different map or scenario that we want to, but the reality is that without these crops, Europe never escapes the cycle of famine that constantly plagued it. It never has a population explosion, probably doesn't have an industrial revolution. Frankly, the 19th century world dominated by European empires that we came to see just doesn't exist. And I would not be shocked if our standard of living was closer to colonial times than today. Even colonization itself would be fundamentally changed. Imagine if the English did eventually go into the Midwest. This land would be planted with primarily wheat, not corn. If you aren't from the Midwest, that probably doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but trust me, it changes everything. So that's certainly a video. Why imagine this? Why look at two continents of people and then think, ah yes, what if they were never there? Why waste all this time? Well really, it's because if they were never there, then the colonization of this land in the first place would have been far more difficult. The Spanish really just took over institutions that already existed. Really, the point here, the whole reason I wanted to make this video, is to just show there's kind of an irony to it all. Simply conquering this land didn't make Spain the superpower that everyone wanted to emulate. Conquering its people did. I don't know, I thought it was a neat idea. Bye.